noticed a big change in Dr. McPherson's approach to the meticulous climate science data that he's accumulated, his approach to the conclusions that he's made about this data. In October, he posted a 4-minute video to his site where he has come to the conclusion that we're basically done for, that the climate is basically going to kill us in not too long time. And what used to manifest in him a number of years ago as frustration and anxiety and anger is now a kind of a mature calm and a really just a gorgeous kindness. And he's now relating to the whole planet as if we are in a hospice situation, that the human race is dying, and we ought to do with our remaining time that which is extremely wholesome, that which is kind, that which is creative, and that which generates love. And that knocked me out. I thought that was fantastic. And so I invited him up, and we've just done a retreat, a meditation retreat for a few days. He's done a few public events. Public events are something that we don't do in Dharma. It's a pretty under-the-radar kind of scene. But I thought that this topic was worth presenting to people who are basically in denial. We're all in denial about what's coming. And Dr. McPherson has proved wonderfully competent in presenting the information with clarity and courage and as I say, this kindness, which you'll notice right away. So here's Dr. Guy McPherson, our guest from Arizona.
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you all for coming. Thanks also to the bookstore for hosting this event. I know what a pain I can be. My wife knows especially well the pain I can be. We're not going to start there, though, are we? So I'm going to read just a couple of chapters from Going Dark, my latest book. It's out in October of last year. I'm going to read the first chapter, which is called Big Stuff, and the final chapter, Only Love Remains. So these are the bookends for this recent book. I'm sorry about the light.
I was wondering that. It's not.
Can.
There's a curtain.
Oh, they won't close?
Yes. Something's wrong with the hell.
Okay, so this first chapter is called Big Stuff, and it starts with a few lines from Lao Tzu in the Tao Te Ching. When man interferes with the Tao, the sky becomes filthy, the earth becomes depleted, the equilibrium crumbles, creatures become extinct. Shortly after the arrival of the 21st century, I realized we were putting the finishing touches on our own extinction, with the shindig probably over within a few decades. During the intervening period, I've seen nothing to sway this belief, and much evidence to reinforce it. Yet the protests, ridicule, and hate mail reach a fervent pitch when I speak or write about the potential for near-term extinction of Homo sapiens. I hear how we're different, we're special, we're too intelligent, we'll find a way out, we always do. We're humans, and therefore animals. Like all life, we're special. Like all organisms, we're susceptible to overshoot. Like all organisms, we will experience population decline after overshoot. Given our tremendous ability to abuse our tremendous power, we will not only drive other species to extinction, but instead will take ourselves into the darkest of existential nights. For my initial 40 years on Earth, I was an unrepentant idealist. Surrounded by students I loved, pursuing a life of excellence rooted in inquiry, striving to serve humanity and the living planet, I cared about humans and other species to the point of heartbreak. I pinned my dreams on people and believed they would rise to the occasion. No more. Color me cynical in the spirit of comedian George Carlin, who died in 2008. Quote, "Scratch any cynic, and you will find a disappointed idealist." End quote. I also spent my first 40 years saving for a rainy day. My wife and I lived on 1/3 of our combined income and socked away plenty of fiat currency for the retirement of leisure we had in our dreams. Looking back through the lenses of knowledge and cynicism, it all seems so surreal. Let's take stock of our current predicaments, beginning with one of several ongoing processes likely to cause our extinction. Then I'll point out the good news, or rather, the not quite so bad news. First, we're headed for extinction via global climate change. It's hotter than it used to be, but not as hot as it's going to be. The political response to this now obvious information is to ignore or disparage the scientists bearing the bad news, which of course is no surprise at all. Not only would any politician who openly contemplates economic contraction shortly find himself out of a job, but discussing human extinction likely would elicit laughter and calls for tar and feathers. Climate change is one of 3 likely extinction events. Well, 3 I know about. I'm certain there are others, and any number can play. Because climate change represents a profound and growing threat to Homo sapiens, an entire chapter is dedicated to its elucidation. And whether you buy a book or not, I would encourage you to pick up one of these bookmarks I have up here. And on the bookmark is a URL for my website that indicates where I routinely update that chapter on climate change. So if you check in there every 2 or 3 days, you'll find the latest news, all of which is bad. And I initially posted that essay in January of 2013, and it was a couple thousand words, and it's up to about 7,000 words now. The words keep getting worse and worse, so you can see where this is headed. We're headed for extinction by environmental collapse, the second means of near-term human extinction, which we're pursuing. The human role in extinction of species and degradation of ecosystems is well documented. Since European settlement in North America, and especially after the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we have witnessed a substantial decline in biological diversity of native taxa and profound changes in assemblages of the remaining species. We have ripped minerals from the earth, often bringing down mountains in the process. We have harvested nearly all the old-growth timber on the continent, replacing 1,000-year-old trees with neatly ordered plantations of small trees. We have hunted species to the point of extinction. We have driven livestock across almost every acre of the continent, bearing hillsides and facilitating massive erosion. We have plowed large landscapes, transforming fertile soil into sterile, lifeless dirt. We have burned ecosystems, and perhaps more importantly, we have extinguished naturally occurring fires. We have paved thousands of acres to facilitate our movement, and in the process have disrupted the movements of thousands of species. We have spewed pollution and dumped garbage, thereby dirtying our water, fouling our air, and contributing greatly to the warming of the planet. We have, to the maximum possible extent allowed by our intellectual and never-ending desire, consumed the planet. In the wake of these endless insults to our only home, perhaps the greatest surprise is that so many native species have persisted, thus allowing our continued enjoyment and exploitation. Every other nation on Earth doggedly pursues America. As a result, nature has joined Wall Street and every country in the industrialized world in bankruptcy. Thanks for playing, but you lose. The banksters on Wall Street win, but only in the very short term. In the long run, we're all dead, as originally pointed out by British economist John Maynard Keynes. And in the current case, the long run is rather short. Among the consequences of taking down a few hundred species each day, at some point, we are the species we take into the abyss. The vanishing point draws nearer every day. Our response in the industrialized world? Bring on the toys. Burn all fossil fuels. Harvest the rainforests and strip mine the soil. Pollute the water, eat the seed bank, foul the air. And most importantly, figure out how we can make a few bucks as the world burns. We have our hand in a monkey trap, and we can't let go. A monkey trap is a small cage with a piece of fruit inside, anchored to a solid object. The cage has a hole barely small enough for a monkey to insert its empty hand, but too small to extract the hand holding a piece of fruit. The monkey is trapped, unable to let go of the fruit. In our case, The trap holds the low-hanging fruit of empire: cheap water, cheap food, cheap fossil fuels, and cheap toys. Homo sapiens, literally the wise ape, is enamored with all things cheap, up to and including life itself. We're headed for extinction via nuclear meltdown. Safely shuttering a nuclear power plant requires a decade or two of careful planning. Far sooner we'll complete the ongoing collapse of the industrial economy. This is a source of my nuclear nightmares. When the world's 440 or so nuclear power plants melt down catastrophically, we've entered an extinction event. Ionizing radiation could and probably will destroy most terrestrial organisms and therefore most marine and freshwater organisms. That, by the way, includes the most unique, special, intelligent animal on Earth. Good news. Oil discovery and extraction tend to follow bell-shaped curves, as described by petroleum geologist M. King Hubbert in a presentation he delivered in 1956. The easily reached light oil is extracted first. Heavier oil, often characterized by high sulfur content, is found at greater depths on land and also offshore. This heavier oil requires more money and more energy to extract and to refine than light oil. Eventually, all fields and regions become unviable economically and energetically. When extracting a barrel of oil requires more energy than contained in the barrel of oil, extraction is pointless. The top of the bell-shaped curve for oil extraction is called peak oil, or Hubbert's Peak. We passed Hubbert's Peak for world oil supply in 2005 or 2006, according to the U.S. Department of Energy's Energy Information Administration and the International Energy Agency, respectively. In response, conventional crude oil has been replaced with liquid substitutes such as tar sands and hydrofractured shale, the costs of which go well beyond financial. The ongoing recession of the world's industrial economy results from the high price of oil and has led to a reduction in demand for oil and numerous other finite commodities, hence leading to reduced prices since the price of crude oil peaked at $147.27 in July 2008. Many geologists and scientists predict a permanent economic depression will result from declining availability of oil and the associated dramatic swings in the price of oil. It seems clear we're locked into a permanent economic emergency. The absence of a politically viable solution to energy decline explains, at least in part, the absence of a governmental response to the issue, even though governments of the world recognize peak oil as a serious problem, a serious threat to civilization. If you're looking for a personal response to the converging crises in which we're immersed, you could do worse than recognizing reality and then let go. Revel in the uniqueness that is the human experience. Acknowledge the wonder of your life, part of which, admittedly the last part, is your death. Again, I invoke the wisdom of George Carlin. Quote, "When you're born into this world, you're given a ticket to the freak show. When you're born in America, you get a front row seat." And then what? As ecologist Garrett Hardin pointed out long before his death more than a decade ago, the ecologically literate question is, and then what? Anybody interested in individual or societal action must be willing to answer this question. With respect to ongoing depletion of fossil fuels, any response to Hardin's question must include the matter of scale. Individuals are able to abandon fossil fuels before they abandon us. Doing so with grace is a bit challenging, but it's hardly impossible. Contemporary industrialized societies, on the other hand, are exhibiting little interest in adapting to a world without ready access to inexpensive fossil fuels. Apparently, the people pulling the primary levers of industry would rather continue fighting than switch to a saner way of living. Individuals are able to maintain a fossil fueled lifestyle with minor costs, including the disparagement that comes from living outside the mainstream. But as illustrated by Jevons paradox and the Kazum-Brooks postulate, individual choices do not translate to societal choices. An individual change in consciousness rarely leads to societal enlightenment. Jumping off the cruise ship of empire will not prevent the ship from striking the iceberg, and it nonetheless results in near-term death of the individual. If we're headed for the exit gate in the near term, the question then arises, what shall I do? How shall I live my life? In other words, now that we have knowledge of the near-term demise of our species, then what? To get back to Garrett Hardin's question. There are more than 7 billion responses to the latter questions. Recognizing that birth is lethal, and that we have an opportunity to demonstrate our humanity on the way out the door, I've chosen an eyes wide open, decidedly countercultural approach. I've opted out of empire to the maximum possible extent, and I practice and promote a gift economy. Beyond my own actions, I suggest individuals take actions they never previously imagined. I promote resistance against the dominant paradigm, even though, especially though, it appears too late to save our species from near-term extinction. I promote assaulting ourselves and others with compassion. I recommend heavy doses of creativity and courage. I advise doing something well beyond the cultural current of the mainstream. At this point, what have you got to lose? What have you got to lose? Indeed, what have we got to lose? The final chapter is titled Only Love Remains. Most people would say I'm not religious. I'm not spiritually religious, although I exhibit some behaviors in a religious manner. I refer to myself as a free thinker, a skeptic, and occasionally an indifferent agnostic or a militant atheist. So the apparently spiritual title of this essay, Only Love Remains, would seem out of character for those who know me. I'll not wander down the road of knowing me, even after 5 decades of study, much of it characterized by the serious introspection allowed those who pursue the life of the mind in the halls of academia. I barely know myself. And I know too little about love, but I'm pretty certain it's all we have. I've tried turning my back on my own emotions and those of others. I've been a rationalist most of my life, and my entire career was spent as a scientist and a teacher. My laser-like focus on reason precluded the ready expression of feelings, an attitude reinforced by the culture in which I came of age, a culture in which the only thing worse than having feelings was expressing them. For most of my life, I've been mystified by public displays of affection and people who mourn the loss of individual lives. After all, as I've known for a long time, nobody gets out alive. Birth is lethal, a notion that applies to cultures and species as well as individuals. My perceived lack of empathy led some to conclude I was a sociopath or a psychopath. My 2 sizes 2 brain can't customarily distinguish the two. Long familiar with his talent as a guitarist, I didn't think the words of Jimi Hendrix applied to my world. Quote, "When the power of love overcomes the love of power, the world will know peace." Recently, I've begun to question my earlier sentiments. Heartbroken, again and again. I keep believing I've worked through each of the 5 Kubler-Ross stages of grief, and then just when my rational side seems to get the upper hand, I'm overwhelmed again and thrust back into the lobby of my own personal heartbreak hotel. A decade ago, as I was editing a book on climate change, I realized we had triggered events likely to cause human extinction by 2030 or so. Notwithstanding neoconservative talking points, aka lies, to the contrary, burning fossil fuels that accumulated over millions of years within the span of a couple centuries is having expectedly horrific impacts on the environment we share with millions of other species. Recognizing the horrors we've triggered, I mourned for months, to the bewilderment of the 3 people who noticed. Shortly thereafter, I was elated to learn about a Hail Mary pass that just might allow our persistence for a few more generations. Peak oil and its economic consequences might bring the industrial economy to an overdue close, just in time to allow our species to persist beyond another generation. It's been a roller coaster ride since then. Oil priced at $147 back in 2008 nearly sent the world's industrial economy into the abattoir. Close, but no life ring. Even as increasingly dire data, models, and climate change assessments roll in, politicians and central bankers have kept the wheels of industry churning. Although we've been in the midst of an economic depression for several years, atmospheric carbon dioxide levels keep rising to record-setting levels each year. As an aside, we found out just 2 days ago that we set a record again in 2013 for carbon dioxide emissions. In fact, the increase was greater than any previous increase in history. Repeat after me, war number 1. Finally, I surrender. We're done. Homo colossus has triggered more than a dozen positive feedback events, any one of which leads to near-term human extinction. The combination is truly lethal. Now what? I abandoned the luxury-filled, high-pay, low-work position I loved as a tenured full professor to go back to the land. I led by example. Vanishingly few followed. I'm reminded of the prescient words attributed to American existential psychologist Rollo May. Quote, "The opposite of courage in our society is not cowardice, it is conformity." My new path presented tremendous challenges for a lifelong academic who could barely distinguish between a screwdriver and a zucchini. I learned new skills, including rough carpentry, plumbing, masonry, gardening, and animal husbandry. Learning by doing, my naivety produced injuries to my body and my psyche. Even before I broke my ribs and suffered numerous minor scrapes and bruises, most of my colleagues concluded I'd gone insane. The conclusion was shared by many of my friends and family members. I'm not ruling that out, by the way. I no longer communicate with most of those colleagues, friends, and family. It's just too difficult to justify the occasional conversation. As an academic conservation biologist, I've long recognized that the living planet sustains our species. I was pointing out the dark underbelly of industrial civilization, even as we were driving some 200 species to extinction every day. But I was ensconced in the underbelly too. Living at the apex of empire, a large city in the southwestern United States, meant compartmentalizing my life. Even as I was teaching the horrors of how we lived, I kept living in that horrifying manner. Through years of intrapersonal conflict, love rarely crossed my mind. The tide rises. I miss teaching, of course. I miss the honored students and inmates with whom I regularly worked. We sought meaningful lives of excellence, and I committed my life to service, primarily to people too often underserved by an irredeemably corrupt system. Along the way, I learned empathy and love from my students. I suspect some of them learned too. But I could not continue to enjoy the city life and face the mirror each day. Such are the hazards of knowledge. Ignorance is bliss, but contrary to the daily choices of the typical American consumer, bliss is overrated. Eventually, I began to remove the cultural shackles that bound me. Living and working in a sparsely populated rural area these past 5 years has provided ample time to think, and think deeply, as I have developed new skills and a new perspective. Surrounded by Earth's bounty and beauty, transformation befell me. More than 4 years after I moved out of Tucson, Arizona, only a few hours in any city induces depression. Now my wife and I share a small property at the edge of empire with another couple and their young son. We raise chickens and ducks for eggs. Goats provide our milk and cheese. A large orchard complements several large gardens near the off-grid straw-bale duplex we inhabit. We are committed to working with other members of our human community as we muddle through a future characterized by collapse on all fronts, economic, environmental, and climatic included. This is not an easy existence, especially relative to my life in the hallowed halls of academia, but it has its own rewards, foremost among them immersion into the real, natural world, and an appreciative, loving human community. The high tide of love. Finally, more than a half-century into a largely unexamined life, I have come to love humanity and the living planet. The wisdom of Jimi Hendrix, long hidden beneath the cultural programming one would expect in the backwoods redneck logging town of my youth, nags at me. The living planet and a decent human community sustain each of us, whether we realize it or not. Our years on this most wondrous of planets, regardless how numerous they are to be celebrated. After all, we get to die, and that makes us the lucky ones. It means we get to live. As I indicated in a previous essay, our knowledge of DNA informs us that the odds against any one of us being here exceeds the odds of being a single atom plucked from the entire universe. The privilege to be here on this life-giving planet at this astonishing time in human history is sufficient to inspire awe in the most uncaring of individuals. At this late juncture in the age of industry, at the dawn of our day on Earth, we still have love. Love for each other, love for our children and grandchildren, love for nature. One could argue it's all we have left. Those who pull the levers in this life-destroying culture care about power to a far greater extent than they care about love. This culture will not know peace. It is much too late for love to extend our run as a culture or a species, too late to employ the wisdom of Jimi Hendrix, but love surely offers redemption to individual humans. Will we as individuals know peace? That's up to us. I suggest most of us will know peace only when we find ourselves lying helpless in the broken arms of our doomed Earth. Thank you for coming and for staying through the whole thing. As I'm reading, I realize, my God, this is really dark stuff. It's almost as if I'm going dark. I'll be here to sign books, and I'll answer questions, and really I'd rather facilitate a discussion for as long as you'd like, certainly for the next half hour or hour till I start to see some discomfort in the audience.